In this video, we're going to engage writing by mouth, which is not exactly the same as dictation, as we will see, but a little bit more complicated than that. So we are going to engage largely from chapter 5 of my book, Gospel Media, in which I try to counter the myth that composition or writing always involved dictation in Greco-Roman antiquity in the New Testament's context, and that dictation was an act of freezing an oral discourse in written form, as if dictating meant taking what was said and putting it into the exact same written form, as if as if writing and speaking were the exact same thing, and that changing the medium did not introduce changes to the discourse. In fact, it did introduce changes to the discourse because we are dealing with different media. So the reality that I present in this chapter is that composition in this context is an interplay between writing and speaking. Both are usually involved when literature is created. And even in the act of dictation, the fact of writing it down, the fact of another person being involved, the scribe, changes the text. And so also not all forms of writing by mouth are dictation. That there's dictation and that there's writing by mouth in different sort of less intentional kinds of ways, as we will see. And so these are not, writing by mouth doesn't always come in the same form, that it's a bit complicated. So we're going to start as we did when we talked about handwriting. We're going to start with elite letter writers. We're going to move to some papyri letters, and then we're going to move into literature proper to try and see the different ways that people wrote by mouth. So when we talked about writing by hand, we saw that there was a preference that personal letters be written by hand, but this is not how it always played out on the ground. It probably usually played out on the ground this way, that people that could write by hand usually did write personal letters by hand, but that didn't always happen. And so we get that here with Marcus Aurelius, a letter to his tutor Fronto. He wrote many, many letters to his tutor Fronto, which we have access to, which is why you see him showing up so many times. But Marcus says, I received your letter and I'm going to enjoy it. I want to tell you really quickly that my daughter is better. And so that's what that first paragraph says right there. So apparently Marcus really wanted to make a quick note to his tutor that his daughter was better. She was sort of on her deathbed, was very seriously ill, and he found a moment, so he dictated a letter, but then he came back to the letter, apparently didn't send it off, came back to it, and then hand wrote the next part, which is implied by the after dictating the above. So Marcus assumes that his tutor Fronto is going to notice that the first paragraph is not written in his hand, and that there's a switch in the handwriting into his own hand. So in this case, as we will see with several other letters, there is variance between being written in the author's own hand and being written in the hand of someone else, a scribe to whom the document is being dictated. We see this with Cicero in a letter to his friend Atticus, and he does this several times in several different letters. We'll say, this is my hand, this is not my hand. I'm dictating this part, I'm handwriting this part. And in this case, Cicero goes back to writing in his own hand because he doesn't want to speak the content to the scribe who is taking dictation. He's saying, what I'm gonna write now is confidential. I don't want this scribe knowing it. I don't want anyone else knowing it. This is sort of for your eyes only. In another case, Cicero gets letters from a friend, like several different letters. They are all handwritten, but he makes this joke saying, hey, these letters are really nice. I really like them, but isn't it weird that you have made handwritten copies of the exact same letter? So the joke is, these are also similar to one another. You wrote about the same thing over and over and over. It looks like a scribe made copy of the same letter. Because remember, very often scribes were enslaved persons that were sort of used as copier in human form. So this gets at the idea that a letter, especially a copied letter, might not be written in the author's own hand. And again, we see a variance in part of a letter being written in a scribe's hand and part of a letter being handwritten by the author. Again, from Cicero writing to a friend, talking about a letter that he received from his friend. And this particular letter was some some military information that was sent to multiple different persons. And so the sort of bulk of the letter was one of those enslaved scribe made copies that was sent to multiple different people. But then there was a PS appended to it that was written in the friend's own hand because it was of a personal nature. And you can see how Cicero sort of shifts his tone here. He says, that last little page in your hand gave me quite a jolt. And then he starts joking. You don't say so. Curio now standing up for Caesar. Who would have thought it? Me, I would have thought it. So he sort of moves into the personal mode as he's addressing the personal part of the PS from this letter from a friend. We also see in the papyri that letters were in fact dictated. Sometimes the sort of identity of the person to whom the letter is dictated peeks through, that they'll say something that indicates that they are the writer, sometimes sort of in their own voice, sometimes in the voice of the author themselves. So in this case, it's the voice of the author themselves, who is not Peteus, but you see this bolded part here that says, Peteus, who is writing the letter for me, salutes you repeatedly, as well as your wife and your daughter and Bassus, your horse. So Peteus is the scribe and sends his own greetings to two people and one animal, wife, daughter, and horse. We get something similar in this papyri letter, and you can see down at the bottom in the last paragraph here that I, Alexandros, so Alexandros starts to write in the first person. This is not the author of the letter. The author of the letter is Thasus, a woman named Thasus, whereas Alexandros is the one that's actually penning the letter, actually inscribing it, writing the physical letters down. And he says, I, Alexandros, wore myself out writing this letter. And if you look over to the letter, you can see why maybe he wore himself out writing this letter. It's a relatively long letter. I've sort of excerpted a lot of it, several paragraphs from it, but you can even see in the sort of physical presentation of the letter that the letters don't flow very well. They sort of look a bit labored, and the document is long. So Alexandros wore himself out because he had a hard time writing this long document. And then one more case of a letter writer's identity peeking through the letter itself comes from the New Testament, Romans chapter 16, where Tertius, who is the writer of the letter of Romans, greets the Roman congregations in the Lord. So Tertius's identity sort of peeks out from behind Paul's identity, and he greets the Roman Christians, and sort of we get the sense of the author or the scribe to whom the text is being dictated, and to whom has a major role in sort of putting their own mind into the document itself, insofar as Tertius is the one writing it down, or perhaps even copying it. He goes, peeks out from behind Paul and greets the Roman Christians. So to draw out some conclusions from what we have just looked at here, both letters and literature, and we're going to look at literature a little bit more closely in just a moment here, could be written either wholly in an author's own hand, that is, it could be wholly handwritten. They could be written wholly in a scribe's hand, and this is the case with some of the letters that we have seen here. That is, they are wholly dictated, or we can have sort of part of a letter or part of a document written in the author's hand and part of it written in a scribe's hand. So a partially dictated document. And we can, when it comes to letters in particular, we can detect dictation best when we actually have a physical letter. And then we can see the multiple hands in the letter. We can see the difference in the handwriting between the scribe and the author. And this very often happens when the author or the sender of the letter does not write the whole thing, doesn't write the body or the main part, but the well wishes, the sort of closing greetings are very often written in the author's own hand as sort of like a personal touch. And we see this especially in business letters. We see it less often in personal letters because if a letter is personal, there's sort of the expectation that the whole thing would be written in their own hand. And so we sometimes have these letters that are written from one single sender, but in different hands. So that some of the letter is handwritten, some of the letter is dictated, and we have when we have these letters that are from the same person, especially multiple letters from the same person that are partially handwritten, partially dictated, or letters that are entirely handwritten by the sender, alongside other letters that are entirely dictated by the same sender, we get to really see the way in which the different minds at work affect the document itself. They sort of affect the medium by having multiple different people involved. And so what we're going to look at is a sort of cache of 4 different letters that are sent from the same person. 2 of them are handwritten and 2 of them are dictated. They are from a woman named Isidora, and we're going to look at the images a little bit here, but on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the handwritten documents, and the right-hand side of the screen, we have the dictated documents. And these are largely business correspondence that Isidora wrote. And where we particularly see some similarities and differences between what is handwritten and what is dictated is in those stock elements of the letters, sort of where you would expect a letter to be the same. Dear so-and-so, sincerely so-and-so, sort of following a particular formula, but different people tend to have different formulae. So like when you write an email, it's going to be a little bit different than how I write an email, but each of us individually are going to sort of generally follow a particular formula for how we are writing an email. That might change a little bit depending on who we are writing to in the context, but largely we're going to sort of have formula that we follow. So in these letters from Isidora, in the ones that are handwritten, you can see that the way that she greets Asklos is exactly the same. So even again, if you don't know Greek, you can compare the words and see that they look exactly the same, and my translation has them also exactly the same. When it comes to the dictated greetings, we actually have some similarity between the 2 letters that are dictated. They look very, very similar to one another. They're not exactly similar, but they do vary a little bit. Actually, they vary quite significantly from the way that Isidora handwrites the greetings. So you can sort of see the scribe's form of doing greetings sort of pushing its way in to the way into Isidora's letter. It's uncertain whether she said, hey, write this person a greeting, or whether she said, greet him this way. But whatever the case, the way that the scribe does the initial greetings is different than the way that Isidora does the greetings when she handwrites them herself. And there's a way in which, when she is handwriting herself, there's a more direct connection from what she is thinking to the words themselves. Whereas if she is thinking a thing, saying it to another person who then has her thought and then writes it down, there's sort of an added layer of mediation there that opens up the opportunity for changes from how she greets when she is just doing it directly from her mind through her hand onto the piece of papyrus. So here are the images. These are of the handwritten documents. Let's go a little bit bigger here. It's a bit hard to see, but you can sort of see the form of her letters are very, very similar to one another. She sort of has really sort of light, thin strokes. So you can see how that looks. Again, even if you don't know Greek, if you were to pause the video and try and compare portions that look the same as one another, you probably be able to notice ways that she forms letters similarly to one another. Let's see if I can just give you one quick example here, particularly with something like her these letters here. These are alphas, the first letter. You can see if you read Greek, a chi, alpha, iota. So that's the word chi. And if you look over here, if we can find a similar one, alpha, alpha iota right here. They look very similar to one another, especially the way that she forms those alphas. And if we look closer at the way that she spells her name, we can really see the similarity in the way that she forms the letters, but also in the way that she spells her name. So she spells her name differently than it was spelled when the letter was dictated. So you can see this is oi, this is the letter O here, letter O here, I, R, A. And then you can see this alpha again. You can sort of see the characteristic way that she makes it. You can almost, like when you zoom in, you can almost even see the way that the reed pen is strokes, the way that she makes it, the way that she does her sort of loops. And so what we find is that she spells her name the same way, that is with the same letters, but you can also see that it looks very similar between the two. Where we see a lot of difference between the handwritten letters and the dictated letters is in the farewells. So in Isidora's handwritten farewells, they are exactly the same as one another. Word for word, there's no difference. Take care of yourself so that you may be well. Goodbye. Exactly the same. Whereas the farewells are really different from that. You can see sort of ways in which there are similarities. These two words, kai se autu in Greek, are exactly the same. There's some similarities here. There's a similarity here, but then there's difference at the end. And then in this other one, there is difference in the middle here. So you can sort of see that her basic formula has this word, yourself, se autu, epimelu, which is take care. That shows up in these different ones. But then other stuff sort of gets stuck in at different places. And then hugiaines, this is the sort of be well part. Or health part is also a part of her sort of stock phrase, but then different things get added in when she dictates a letter. So all of this to say is that when there are two minds involved, when another mind enters in and into the composition process, we see more changes. That when one person is just writing a singular thing, they are more consistent. They're more likely to write the same thing that they are thinking. Whereas when another mind gets involved, you have a little bit more space for changes to come in and be made. And so what I want to do is offer some conclusions here with respect to multiple minds being involved versus one mind being involved in the process of composition. So when another brain gets involved in the writing process, it means that dictated texts are always sort of further mediated. That is to say, it's a less direct movement from what is in the mind, the sort of core of the medium, the human thought, to the writing, insofar as it travels through another medium, the medium of speech, to another person's brain, and then that other person is doing the act of writing. But this comes in degrees. So mediation, when it comes through another person, is more or less mediated. And we get more or less of a glimpse of the writer. So when the horse is greeted in Peteus's greeting, it's not Peteus directly writing. Peteus is directly writing, but what he says, Peteus who is writing, so he writes in the third person, there's sort of still a little bit of a distance from Peteus. Whereas in the example from Alexandros, Alexandros's identity peeks through more directly. He says, hey, hi, me, Alexandros. peeking out, you see me a little bit more directly here. Same thing with Tertius in Romans. You get more of a glimpse of Tertius in Romans than Paul saying, hey, Tertius also greets you all, as if Paul were saying it in the third person. Rather, Tertius pops in the first person. And so the other thing we find is that on occasion, dictation is more or less a direct transcription of the author's words. So there are cases in which a scribe is sort of is able to take what the person says and write it down pretty closely. And what's interesting here is that when one speaks words, when one says them out loud rather than writing them, there's a difference. We communicate differently in speaking than in writing because writing slows us down. Writing is visualized, so we sort of edit it. We make more complex grammatical structures. So there are things that sort of characterize speaking, especially spoken storytelling versus written storytelling. And we see this reflected in some of these letters and in different literature that is more oral in nature, that is more sort of oral transcription. So some of the things that are characteristic of speaking, especially stories, is the frequent use of and. This is called parataxis. A relative absence of subordinating conjunctions. So we don't make our clauses into sort of complex relationship with one another. Rather, we just sort of just string them along, and this happened and that happened and so on and so forth. A direct discourse, that is direct statements of what people said, with that, or hati in Greek. He said that, and then going on to say what it was he said, or directly reporting what was said. And there's also sort of a unique vocabulary to speaking. There are things that when we write them that are sort of the sort of a spoken mode, they're less appropriate in writing, or they're sort of deemed more ungrammatical or not fit for the written mode. So oftentimes in our editing, we're editing out the things that we would say, but because writing is a different medium with a sort of different set of grammatical rules to it, we will oftentimes change those things. And it wasn't just letters that were written by mouth or dictated, but literature could also be written by mouth. And we're going to look at some examples of how this worked out in different kinds of ways. So we have direct evidence to people writing by mouth from a couple of different resources. We get it from Quintilian in his advice that one not write by mouth. He sort of is a great champion of writing by hand. So he says an opposite fault to the one that he was just talking about is committed by people who elect to make a draft of their whole subject as rapidly as possible and write impromptu, following the heat and impulse of the moment. They call this draft their raw material. So we saw this with respect to Porphyry and Plotinus, who would just write out as much as he can, making it sort of just a flow of everything that he thought. Quintilian then says they then revise those effusions and give them rhythmical structure. The words and the rhythms are corrected, but the original triviality of the hastily accumulated material is still there. Quintilian says the better practice is to exercise care from the start, to write carefully from the start, and shape the work from the first stages in such a way that it needs only be chiseled into shape, not begun again from scratch. So what Quintilian is saying here, he's not talking about dictation yet. He's going to in just a second here. But he's saying those who just write out their thoughts as quickly as they can, there's sort of a way in which that is a lot like speaking. You're just sort of pouring forth the stuff. Quintilian says that's not the best way to write. You need to be careful from the beginning and edit as you go. And so he says, because I condemn this kind of writing, it should be absolutely clear what I think about dictation. He says, when we write, however rapidly, our thoughts are to some extent slowed down by the inability of the hand to keep up with their speed. So he's sort of calling attention to a limitation or a constraint of writing here, saying it is slower than speech. An amanuensis or scribe, on the other hand, is impatient, and we may sometimes feel ashamed to hesitate or pause or alter as though we were afraid of his witness to our weakness. So the idea being sort of that if you're dictating, you might just keep pressing forward with what you're saying without sort of carefully thinking and editing as you go, because of the fact of someone else being in the room, the sort of social implication of not wanting to pause, not wanting to slow down, and not wanting to appear sort of silly or weak in the ability to dictate. So he says, what pours out when you dictate is not only unpolished and casual. So Quintilian is saying there's sort of a characteristic way that dictated texts read, unpolished and casual, but they're sometimes off the point because our whole subject is to have no interruption in the flow of our speech. So all this to say, Quintilian opposes dictation for the same reason that he opposes just writing out all of your thoughts as quickly as you can, is that it doesn't edit things and it makes for a particular style that he calls unpolished and casual. Horace notes something very, very similar as he's sort of critiquing the practice of a certain Lucilius. He says that Lucilius, in an hour, as though this were a great exploit, as though this were an awesome thing that he could do, would dictate 200 lines while standing, as they say, on one foot. So Horace is saying, this is sort of a careless way of writing. He's standing on one foot and just dictating his stuff sort of as he goes without a real thought to what is being written. So Horace is going to say in his muddy stream. So he's saying, this is like sort of a filthy flow of words that isn't clean. It's not well edited. There was much that you would like to remove. He was wordy and too lazy to put up with the trouble of writing. That is the trouble of editing as one writes, or writing correctly, I mean. Whereas the quantity, I let that pass. Like I admit that he wrote a ton because he wrote this way. He wrote via dictation and was able to just sort of say the things without editing them, which made him be able to write a whole lot more. So those are examples of someone sort of intentionally dictating, saying, I'm going to speak these things and have them written down. With Galen, and then again, we're going to move back to Quintilian, we find a different kind of writing by mouth. So not all writing by mouth, in my view, is dictation. Dictation, to my mind, involves intention. It's, I know this thing is being written down right now, and I'm going to craft my words with an eye to it being written down, even if I'm not editing carefully, which is the critique of Horace and Quintilian. I know that the thing is being written down. There's an intention to the dictation. The speaking is happening so that a written document is produced. Galen talks about other instances where there's a connection between what he has said in a speaking context to the written context. And sometimes Galen says, I spoke these things and now I'm writing them down. There's a connection to them. And this is especially the case with these first two texts, the Versobulus, which is named after the person it's written to, and Affections and Errors, that sort of Galen knows he's making a document, but he's making that document based off of oral teaching. In the last text here, Galen is sort of giving an overview of his own books and how they came about. And he says that many of his books came about because they weren't written for publication, but they were written up from oral lectures, that these lectures were sort of textualized. Sometimes Galen meant to make them into texts, like the first two. Other times, other students were there. They were the ones who took down what Galen said in his teaching context. He's not trying to write something, he's just teaching. Other people write them down, and then those writings from those other people sort of get out there. And so they don't have the polish and the finishedness that Galen's other texts do, that he's taken the time to sort of go over the writing of. And we're going to close out with respect to writing by mouth here, again with Quintilian in his preface to the Order's Education, which is where we've taken so many of these testimonies to handwriting and to, on the opposite side, dictation, which is not Quintilian's preferred practice. Quintilian says that 2 books on the art of rhetoric, 2 books similar to this book that you now hold in your hand, are already circulating in my name, though they weren't published by me, nor were they prepared for this purpose. One is a 2-day lecture course, which was taken down by the slaves to whom the responsibility was given. So someone sent along some enslaved scribe, said, hey, write down the things that Quintilian says, write down the teaching so that I can have a written form of it. The other lecture course, which spread over several days, was taken down by shorthand. So someone, again, trying to write down quickly what he is saying by some excellent young men who were nevertheless too fond of me. So sort of Galen's fanboys are writing up what he says, and they rashly publish it in order to try and honor him. So then Galen says, in the work that you hold in your hand, if you've seen these other sort of pirated versions, you'll notice that this work that you now hold in your hands, there's some similarities to those. The things I taught about, it's going to have some of the same content, but it's going to look a lot different. Many things are going to be changed. Many things are going to be added. And on the whole, it will be better written. So when a thing is written, when you have the time to sort of look over what is written and edit as you go, you get a better written product than something that is just taken down from word of mouth. So to move to some conclusions about writing by mouth, dictation was employed in place of and in conjunction with writing by hand. So you can write by hand, you can dictate, even one single document can be a mixture of the two. When writing by mouth does happen, someone else's thoughts, words, and style are necessarily brought into the discourse at varying levels. Number 3, some writers are going to object to dictation altogether, especially to create new material because it comes out in such an imperfect flow. Despite those objections of some authors, many authors did dictate during the writing process for a number of different reasons. And one of the most common reasons was to create a final clean copy of a text. So you could have a case where someone handwrites themselves an entire copy, and then they read out or dictate that copy that they made to an enslaved scribe in order to make the clean final copy of it. Number 6 here, a text that is written by mouth may or may not represent the words that were spoken. So sometimes they are direct representation of what was spoken. Sometimes the mediation of the other mind involved is a lot stronger, and there is less of a direct connection to what was actually said. Next, dictation, especially when it's done hastily, could result in inelegant writing. We have several different authors saying when people dictated this way, it made for an inferior style and product. We also find, we didn't address this in this video, but when there's not very many direct quotations from other texts, this could be excused by hasty dictation. Some people will say, hey, I dictated this pretty quickly, so I didn't quote scripture, or I dictated this really quickly, so I didn't really check my sources. They say something sort of kind of like this. And then the last one here, texts that are written from an antecedent oral event and are not amended, not edited by their speaker, could be considered incomplete with respect to both their content and style. So if something is taken down from an oral teaching situation, oftentimes the expectation would be that that thing would get fixed up. It would get written better, and all of the content, anything that might have been left out, would get added in later on. And the reason that this is going to be important, because this is sort of exactly what we see with respect to the Synoptic Gospels, that Mark is often characterized as sort of as not stylistic, or not in the appropriate style of a written text. That gets cleaned up by Matthew and Luke, who also add, excuse me, additional content to Mark. They supplement it. They supplement it both with respect to its style, but also with respect to what is in the gospel itself.